There is a farmhouse not 3 miles from where I grew up. It has been standing since 1887. The family inside it has never paid a heating bill. Not once. Not in 137 years. I have watched 4 generations of that family wake before sunrise, tend the same stove, pump the same water, pack the same root cellar. And every single year, when the English neighbors are opening utility statements in January, that farmhouse is warm, fed, and completely unbothered. I want to show you exactly how they do it. Not the philosophy, the actual daily rhythm, the specific tasks, the specific times, the specific reasons each one quietly eliminates a bill that most people have simply accepted as unavoidable. Stay with me through this, because the last thing I am going to show you, the one practice almost nobody outside these communities has ever thought to apply, that is the one that makes the entire system lock together. The day begins at the stove. It has begun at the stove in these houses for as long as anyone I know can remember. By 5 in the morning, sometimes earlier in January, the first task is already done. The firebox has been checked. The coals from the night before have been read the way a baker reads a crust. If they are still orange at the center, the stove is banked correctly. 2 or 3 pieces of split hardwood go in. The damper is adjusted, and within 20 minutes, that kitchen is warm enough to work in. This is not complicated, but the discipline of it, the daily, unbroken, year-round practice of tending a heat source before anything else happens, is what separates this system from every modern alternative I have ever watched fail. Here is the math I have observed across 8 decades of watching these families operate. A cord of seasoned hardwood, oak, hickory, or ash costs between $200 and $300 in most rural areas, depending on the year and the county. A well-managed wood stove in a properly insulated farmhouse burns between 3 and 5 cords across a full heating season. Call it $1,000 in the worst case. The average American household heating bill, gas, electric, or oil combined, runs between $1,500 and $2,500 a year, and that number has climbed every single winter I can remember. But the stove tending is not just about the fuel cost. It is about what the continuous practice does to the house itself. A wood stove that is tended properly, fed on a rhythm, never allowed to go fully cold in winter, never overfired in a panic, produces a different quality of heat than a furnace cycling on and off. The thermal mass of a cast iron stove, and especially of a masonry surround if the family has built one, holds warmth for hours after the fire drops. The house does not swing between 62 degrees and 72 degrees the way a forced air system does. It sits. It holds. The walls absorb the warmth and give it back slowly. I have stood in these kitchens at 11 o'clock at night, hours after the last log went in, and felt the air still comfortable. That is not luck. That is the result of a morning practice done correctly for decades. The families I watched never talked about this as a system. It was simply what you did before breakfast. But what they were doing, without naming it, was managing thermal mass the way an engineer would. They just learned it from their parents, who learned it from theirs. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever heated with wood? I want to know what you observed. The second task of the morning happens within the same half hour as the stove tending, and it is the one that surprises English visitors the most when they see it for the first time. The water is pumped before the household needs it, not when someone is thirsty, not when the dishes need washing, before. The cistern or the holding tank, and whatever the house uses, is topped off first thing while the stove is coming up to temperature. It takes 10 minutes, maybe 15 if the tank has run low overnight, and then the water is simply there all day, without a pump running, without electricity cycling, without a pressure tank motor wearing itself out. I grew up watching this. My Amish neighbors, the Stoltzfus family, the Bylers, the Lapps on the far side of the ridge, all of them had some version of a gravity-fed holding system. Water pumped up by hand or by a small hydraulic ram into a tank set high in the house or in a dedicated outbuilding. From there, gravity did the distribution. No electric pump, no pressure switch, no monthly electric bill for a well pump running 400 hours a year. The hydraulic ram pump is a piece of engineering that has been quietly carrying water on these farms for over a century and a half. It uses the momentum of flowing water from a stream or spring to push a smaller portion of that water uphill to a storage tank. No electricity, no fuel, no moving parts beyond 2 check valves. I have watched the same ram pump run on a Lancaster County farm for 30 years without a single repair beyond replacing a rubber valve seat. Now I know what some of you are thinking. You do not have a stream. You do not have a spring. Fair enough. But the principle, pump or collect water at a scheduled time into a gravity-fed reservoir and let gravity do the distribution, that principle works with a modern well and a small 12-volt solar pump just as well as it did with a hydraulic ram in 1890. The Amish adapted the principle to their landscape. The principle itself belongs to anyone willing to apply it. The monthly cost of running a standard submersible well pump in an American home runs between $30 and $80 in electricity alone, depending on depth and usage. Over a year, that is between $360 and $960. Over a decade, it is real money. The families I watched spent none of it. They spent 15 minutes of morning labor instead. Time is the currency this system runs on, not dollars. The stove that heated the kitchen is the same stove that cooked breakfast. This is a detail so obvious that most people miss its significance entirely. There is no separate appliance. There is no electric range drawing 4 to 7 kilowatts. There is no gas line with a monthly minimum charge. The heat that warmed the room is the same heat that cooked the food. The fuel was already burning. The meal was simply placed on top of it. I have watched Amish women cook full breakfast for families of 8 or 10 people on a single wood stove without any visible effort at managing it. They understood the cooktop the way a professional chef understands a gas range, which zones ran hotter, where to move a pot to slow a simmer, how to use the warming shelf above the firebox for bread or biscuits. That knowledge came from years of daily practice. It was not written down anywhere. It was in the hands. The modern American kitchen runs on somewhere between $40 and $80 of electricity per month just for cooking and refrigeration, depending on the appliances and the household size. The Amish kitchen runs on wood that was cut from the farm's own woodlot, or purchased once a year in a single cord delivery. The stove does not have a utility meter attached to it. It simply burns what you put in it and returns heat in every direction. The cookstove also does something a modern range cannot do. It heats the kitchen while it cooks. In winter, that is not a side effect. It is the point. The morning cooking session is also the morning heating session. One fire. 2 functions. The efficiency is not accidental. It is the result of 2 centuries of people living without the option of waste. Here is what I want you to sit with for a moment. These families did not choose this rhythm because they read about it in a book. They chose it because it worked. Because it kept working. Because every generation that tried to simplify it discovered that the simplification cost more than the practice. If this is landing for you, if you are starting to see the shape of what I am describing, leave a like on this video. I want to know how many of you are actually watching this the whole way through. There is a moment in mid-morning, usually after the breakfast dishes are done and the younger children are at their lessons, when someone in the household makes a quiet trip to the woodpile. Not because the stove is running low, because it is mid-morning, because that is when the trip happens. This is the part of the rhythm that English visitors rarely understand when they first see it. The Amish do not wait until the wood box is empty. They do not scramble for fuel in the dark when the fire is dying. They replenish on a schedule before depletion every single day. The wood box beside the stove is always at least half full, always. I have thought about this practice for a long time, and I think it is the most transferable lesson in this entire rhythm. It is not about wood. It is about the discipline of replenishment before crisis. The families I watched applied this same principle to everything they managed. The root cellar was restocked before it ran low, not after. The water tank was filled before the morning draw, not during it. The lamp oil was checked in the afternoon, not when the light went out. Every resource in the household was managed at a scheduled moment, before need became urgent. What this does, and I have watched it do this across 8 decades, is remove the emergency from daily life. There are no panicked trips to the hardware store in January. There are no utility company calls because something ran out. There is no crisis because the system is designed to prevent one. The wood run takes 15 minutes, maybe 20 if the pile needs restacking. It happens every mid-morning, rain or shine, warm or cold. And because it happens every day, the household never experiences the wood equivalent of an empty tank. Modern households manage resources reactively. They buy when they run out. They call when something fails. They pay emergency rates because they waited. The Amish manage resources proactively, on a rhythm, before the shortage arrives. The difference in cost over a year, over a decade, is staggering. I have watched families on these farms go through winters that would have bankrupted an English household in heating costs alone and come out in March with money in the drawer and wood still on the pile. Somewhere around mid-morning, after the wood has been brought in and the kitchen has settled into its working temperature, someone goes down to the root cellar, not for an emergency, not because something is needed urgently, as a check. A daily observation of what is down there, what is holding, what needs to be used before it turns. I have been in root cellars on these farms dozens of times over the years. The ones built correctly, and the old order families build them correctly because they have been building them for 2 centuries, hold at exactly the right temperature without any mechanical assistance. 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit is the target. That is the temperature at which most root vegetables, carrots, turnips, beets, potatoes, parsnips hold for months without refrigeration. It is also the temperature at which hard cheeses and cured meats keep safely. The temperature in a properly sited root cellar is not an accident. It is the result of building below the frost line, typically 4 feet or deeper in most of the Northeast, and using the thermal mass of the surrounding earth as a temperature regulator. The earth at that depth does not freeze in winter. It does not overheat in summer. It sits year-round within a few degrees of that 55-degree target. The families I watched did not run a refrigerator for most of what they stored. They ran a hole in the ground. And that hole, built once correctly, lasted generations. I know of root cellars on Lancaster County farms that have been in continuous use since the 1880s. The same stone walls, the same earthen floor, the same wooden shelving, replaced once or twice over the century. No compressor, no refrigerant, no electricity, no monthly bill. The daily check is what keeps the system working, because root storage is not passive. It requires observation. A potato that begins to soften needs to be used or removed before it spreads rot to its neighbors. A jar with a compromised seal needs to come upstairs before it becomes a problem. The 10-minute daily check is what separates a root cellar that works from one that wastes everything stored in it. This is the pattern I keep watching. 10 minutes of daily attention prevents $100 of loss. 15 minutes of morning practice eliminates a $100 monthly bill. The Amish are not doing anything magical. They are doing small, consistent things at the right time, every day, without exception. Tell me in the comments, have you ever used a root cellar? Or seen one that was still working? I would genuinely like to know what you observed. The midday meal in an Amish household is not lunch in the way an English family understands lunch. It is the main meal of the day. The largest, the most deliberate, and it is built almost entirely from what is already in the house, from the root cellar, from the pantry, from the previous day's leftovers transformed into something new. I have sat at these tables. The food is simple, and it is substantial. Bean soup made from dried beans soaked the night before. Bread baked in the wood oven while the morning's work was happening. Pickled vegetables from last summer's garden. Occasionally meat, but not always, and not in the quantities an English household would consider normal. What I want to point out is the waste mathematics of this system. The average American household throws away between 30 and 40% of the food it purchases. That number comes from years of observation by people who study food systems. And I believe it, because I have watched English kitchens operate. Things are bought, forgotten, and discarded. Leftovers sit until they are unrecognizable. Produce bought with good intentions wilts in the refrigerator. The Amish households I watched wasted almost nothing. Not because they were virtuous in some abstract sense, but because the daily rhythm forced a constant accounting of what was on hand. The root cellar check in the morning told you what needed to be used. The midday meal was planned around that. The evening meal was planned around what the midday meal left over. Nothing sat forgotten because nothing was invisible. The root cellar and the pantry were not storage facilities. They were working inventories, checked daily, drawn down deliberately, replenished in season. The grocery bill for a family operating this way is a fraction of what an English family of the same size spends. Not because they eat less. These are working people doing physical labor, and they eat well. But because almost nothing is wasted, and almost everything consumed was either grown on the property or purchased in bulk at the right season. That gap between the English food budget and the Amish food budget for a family of the same size is one of the quietest utility eliminations in this entire system. It does not show up as a line item on a bill. It simply never leaves the household. By mid-afternoon, the household's attention shifts from production to preparation. The water tank, if it has been drawn down through the day's cooking and washing, gets a second pumping. This is not always necessary, but when it is needed, it happens in the afternoon, not in the evening when it is dark and cold, and not in the morning when the stove demands attention. It happens in the window of the day, when the task is easy and the consequences of skipping it have not yet arrived. The lamps are attended to in the same window. I want to spend a moment on the lamps because this is a practice that has outlived every prediction I ever heard about it disappearing. The old order families I have watched for 8 decades still use kerosene lamps as their primary interior light source. Not as a statement, not as a performance of simplicity. Because the lamps work, they are inexpensive to operate, they require no infrastructure, and they produce a quality of light that, I will say this plainly, is easier to sit with for an evening than overhead fluorescent or LED lighting. The afternoon lamp check takes 10 minutes. Wicks are trimmed to the correct height. A wick that is too tall produces soot. A wick that is too short produces a dim, unsteady flame. Glass chimneys are wiped clean with a dry cloth. Reservoirs are filled to the correct level. By the time evening comes, every lamp in the house is ready. There is no scrambling in the dark for matches or oil. The preparation happened in the light. The cost of operating kerosene lamps for an entire household's evening lighting runs between $8 and $15 a month, depending on the hours of use and the current price of kerosene. The average American electric lighting bill, even with LED bulbs, runs between $20 and $40 per month when calculated as a share of the total electric bill. That is not a dramatic savings on its own, but it is part of a pattern. Every afternoon preparation task in this household eliminates a reactive cost, an emergency purchase, a repair call, a utility overage that would otherwise arrive unpredictably. The predictability itself has a value that does not show up in any monthly statement. What I have watched across 8 decades is a household that is never surprised by its own needs. That is rarer than it sounds. If what I have shown you so far, the stove rhythm, the water discipline, the root cellar, the lamp preparation, if any of that has landed differently than you expected, I want you to stay with me through the second half of this video. Because what I have described so far is the morning and afternoon, the rhythm that holds the household through the day. But the evening practice and the weekly cadence that makes the whole system possible, that is where the real mathematics of this life become clear. If you are the kind of person who watches a video like this all the way through, subscribing takes 1 second. And what I'm about to show you in the next section is the part that took me the longest to fully understand. I watched it for years before I saw what it was actually doing. The evening in an Amish household does not end the way an English evening ends. There is no gradual drift toward bed while the television runs. There is a sequence of closing tasks, deliberate ordered, done in the same way every night, that sets the household up for the morning that is coming. The stove is banked. This is not simply turning down the heat. Banking a wood stove for the night is a skill. You need enough coals to hold through the coldest hours, typically between 2 and 4 in the morning in a hard winter, without the fire going completely out, but without burning so hot that you waste fuel on a sleeping house. The damper is set to a specific position. The airflow is reduced. The coals are arranged to maximize their surface area against the remaining fuel. I have watched men do this in 30 seconds without thinking about it because they have done it every night for 40 years. The muscle memory is complete. But the knowledge behind it, the understanding of how a specific stove in a specific house behaves on a cold night, that took years to acquire. A house whose stove is properly banked wakes up to a kitchen that is still 45 to 50 degrees, with live coals that can be brought back to a working fire in 10 minutes. A house whose fire went out overnight wakes up to a kitchen that may be 30 degrees, or colder, requires an hour to warm, and demands more fuel to recover than it would have cost to simply bank correctly the night before. The evening when-down also includes the final water check. Is the tank full enough for morning? And the lamp extinguishing sequence done in order, room by room, so that no lamp is left burning unattended. These tasks together take 20 minutes. They feel like maintenance. They are actually insurance. They guarantee that the morning begins from a position of readiness rather than recovery. What I have observed, watching these households across decades, is that the evening practice is where the discipline is most visible. The morning practice runs on momentum. You wake up, the cold reminds you, the stove calls you. But the evening practice requires you to close out the day correctly when you are tired, and the warmth of the house is telling you to simply sit down. The families who do it consistently, who never skip the banking, who always check the water, who always trim the wicks before bed, those are the families whose systems hold for generations. I have watched what happens when the practice slips. It is always small at first, a lamp left a little low, a stove banked a little carelessly, and then one morning, the recovery costs more than the habit would have. The daily rhythm I have described does not stand alone. It sits inside a weekly cadence that makes it possible. Because the Amish do not cook every meal from scratch every day. They do not process every vegetable the day it is needed. They do not make decisions about what to eat at the moment they are hungry. The weekly cadence, the specific days assigned to specific large tasks, is what keeps the daily rhythm from becoming overwhelming. Bread is baked once or twice a week, in large batches, in the wood oven that is already hot from the morning fire, 6 to 8 loaves at a time. The oven is going anyway. The fuel cost of baking 8 loaves is the same as baking 2, because the oven is already at temperature. You simply fill it. Laundry has a day. In the households I watched, it was almost always Monday. The wash water was heated on the stove. Again, the stove that was already burning. The wash was done in the morning while the fire was hottest. The clothes were hung to dry, and by evening, the task was complete for the week. The garden has days. The preserving has days. The deep cleaning of the house has days. Every large task is assigned to a specific point in the week, done in full at that point, and then not revisited until the following week. What this does to the household economy is profound, and it took me years of watching to fully appreciate it. When you batch a task, you pay the setup cost once. You heat the oven once and bake for 2 hours, instead of heating it 7 times for 20 minutes each. You heat the wash water once and wash everything instead of heating it daily for small loads. You drive to the bulk food store once a month and buy in quantity instead of making small purchases at full retail price 3 times a week. The batch discipline is where a significant portion of the financial savings in this life actually live. Not in any single dramatic decision, but in the accumulated efficiency of doing large things at the right time, in the right quantity, with the setup cost paid only once. I have calculated, roughly, from years of observation, that a household operating on this weekly cadence spends somewhere between 40 and 60% less on food, fuel, and consumables than an English household of the same size. Not because they sacrifice, because they do not pay setup costs repeatedly. They pay them once and extract full value. If you know someone who is trying to get their household costs under control, someone who feels like the bills are always ahead of them no matter what they do, send them this video. What I am describing is not a lifestyle choice, it is an engineering solution, and it works for anyone willing to apply it. Everything I have described, the morning stove tending, the water discipline, the root cellar check, the lamp preparation, the evening banking, the weekly batch work, all of it sits inside a larger annual rhythm that makes it sustainable across a lifetime. The Amish do not think about winter heating in January. They think about it in April, when the wood is cut and split and stacked to season. They do not think about food storage in November. They think about it in May, when the garden plan is set and the seed order is placed. They do not scramble for preserved food in February. They filled the root cellar in September, when the harvest came in and the preserving days ran long. The annual rhythm is the master system. The daily and weekly rhythms are simply expressions of it. I want to give you the actual numbers I have watched these families operate on because I think the specificity matters. A family of 6 operating on the full rhythm I have described typically processes between 300 and 500 quarts of preserved food across a summer and fall season. That is green beans, tomatoes, corn, apple butter, pickled vegetables, jams, and fruit. That food, purchased at retail in winter, would cost between $800 and $1,500. It is produced and preserved for the cost of seeds, canning lids, and fuel, typically under $200 total because the labor is family labor and the fuel is the same wood stove that is already burning. The wood pile for a full winter, 3 to 5 cords of seasoned hardwood, is assembled in spring and summer when the cutting is easiest and the wood has time to dry. Cutting green wood in October and trying to burn it in November is an English mistake. Cutting in April and burning in December is an Amish practice. The difference in heat output between green wood and properly seasoned wood, wood that has dried for at least 6 months, is significant. Seasoned hardwood produces roughly twice the usable heat per cord as green wood of the same species. The water system is winterized in late fall, pipes drained, cisterns checked, any exposed fittings protected, and opened again in spring. This is a half-day task that prevents the kind of pipe failures that cost English homeowners thousands of dollars in emergency plumber calls every January. The garden is planned in February when the seed catalogs arrive and the root cellar inventory tells you what ran short and what was surplus. The planting sequence is designed around the root cellar's capacity. You do not grow more than you can store. You do not store more than you can use before the next harvest. The system is self-correcting because it is observed daily and adjusted seasonally. What I have watched across 8 decades of living beside these families is a household economy that is almost entirely insulated from the price shocks and supply disruptions that regularly destabilize English households. When fuel prices doubled in the winters I can remember, these families did not notice. When food prices spiked, they were drawing from a cellar they had filled at summer prices. When utility companies raised rates, there was no utility company involved. If you have stayed with me through all of this, through the stove tending and the water discipline and the root cellar and the weekly cadence and the annual rhythm, then you are not an average viewer. You are someone who is genuinely thinking about how a household can operate differently. We put this kind of depth into every video on this channel. If that is what you are looking for, subscribing is the right move. There is more of this waiting for you. But before I close, I want to tell you the thing I promised at the beginning. The practice that makes the entire system lock together. The one that almost nobody outside these communities has ever thought to apply. There is a practice I have watched in every Amish household that has maintained its full rhythm across generations. It is not the stove tending. It is not the root cellar. It is not the water system, or the lamp preparation, or the batch baking. It is the evening accounting. Every night, in the households I watched most closely, someone, usually the head of the household, sometimes a spouse, spent 10 to 15 minutes with a simple written record. Not a spreadsheet, not a budget app. A ledger book, or in some houses simply a ruled notebook. What went out of the root cellar today? What came in? What the wood supply looks like? What the water tank held at the end of the day? What was used from the pantry? What needs to be replenished and when? This is not financial accounting in the modern sense, it is resource accounting. The daily observation of what the household consumed and what it holds in reserve. I have thought about why this practice is so important, and I have come to believe it is the practice that makes all the others possible, because without it, the daily rhythm becomes invisible to itself. You tend the stove every morning, but you do not know how fast you are burning through the cord. You check the root cellar every day, but without a record, you cannot see the rate of draw. You pump the water, but you cannot tell whether the tank is holding or whether something is slowly leaking. The evening accounting makes the system legible. It turns a collection of daily habits into a managed system. And a managed system can be adjusted. A managed system can see a problem coming 6 weeks before it arrives and correct it with a small action rather than an expensive emergency. I watched one family, it was the Lapps, on the east side of the ridge, keep this ledger continuously for 3 generations. The grandfather started it, the father maintained it, the son still keeps it. When I asked the son about it once, he said something I have not forgotten. He said, "The book does not tell us what to do. It tells us what we have done. And from that, we can see what is coming." That is the practice. That is the one that holds the system together, not the stove, not the water, not the root cellar. The daily act of looking at what you have consumed and what you hold in reserve written down in a book by lamplight before you sleep. Be honest with yourself right now. When did you last know, specifically, what your household consumed in a week, not what you spent? What you consumed. Drop a 1 in the comments if you track it. Drop a 2 if you do not. I want to see that number. The farmhouse not 3 miles from where I grew up has never paid a heating bill. Now you know why. It is not mystery. It is rhythm, tended daily, observed nightly, carried forward across generations by people who understood that time, spent correctly, is worth more than any utility payment you will ever make. Thanks for watching. The end screen has more in this same world. Pick whichever video on the end screen calls to you. There is more here worth your time.